Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Um, it's Happy March. It's Childhood Games Month, and you know what that means? That means that we're gonna be doing things from my childhood, and I figured Paper Cuts could get in on the fun too. I read plenty of books as a kid, and I've dug up a book that I was particularly fond of as a child, and I'm incredibly nostalgic for. So we'll see how it goes. Uh, also, uh, there has been a schedule change. I know y'all aren't used to having Paper Cuts be live on Thursdays, but uh, I've made that change so that LGBT and D, the Dungeons and Dragons podcast, I am on and was on hiatus for a little bit. That so that it can come out of its hiatus because Friday actually worked the best for everybody else. So I moved Paper Cuts off Friday and we're on Thursdays now, which is weird because now the stream VOD goes up earlier in the same day as the Paper Cut stream happens. But anyway, that's enough digressing. Let's begin The Secret Garden. Chapter 1. There's no one left. When Mary Lennox was sent to Misselthwaite Manor to live with her uncle, everybody said she was the most disagreeable-looking child ever seen. It was true, too. She had a little thin face and a little thin body, thin light hair and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow and her face was yellow because she'd been born in India and had always been ill in one way or another. Her father had held a position under the English government and as such had always been busy and ill himself, and her mother had been a great beauty who cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with gay people. She hadn't wanted a little girl at all, and so when Mary was born she handed her over to the care of an ayah, who was made to understand that if she wished to please the Mem Sahib, she must keep the child out of sight as much as possible. So when she was a sickly, fretful, ugly little baby, she was kept out of the way, and when she became a sickly, fretful, toddling thing, she was kept out of the way also. She never remembered seeing familiarly anything but the dark faces of her ayah and the other native servants, and as always they obeyed her and gave her her own way in everything, because the Mem Sahib would be angry if she was disturbed by her crying, and by the time she was 6 years old she was as tyrannical and selfish a little pig as had ever lived. The young English governess who came to teach her to read and write disliked her so much that she gave up her place in 3 months, and when other governesses came to try to fill it, they always went away in a shorter time than the first one. So if Mary had not chosen to really want to know how to read books, she would never have learned her letters at all. And one frightfully hot morning, when she was about 9 years old and awakened feeling very cross, she became crosser still when she saw that her servant who stood by her bedside was not her ayah. "Why did you come?" she said to the strange woman. "I will not let you stay. Send my ayah to me." And the woman looked frightened, but she only stammered that the ayah could not come, and when Mary threw herself into a passion and beat and kicked her, she only looked more frightened and repeated that it was not possible for the ayah to come to Missy Sahib. And there was something mysterious in the air that morning. Nothing was done in its regular order, and several of the native servants seemed missing, while those whom Mary saw slunk or hurried about with ashen and scared faces. But no one would tell her anything, and her ayah didn't come. She was actually left alone as the morning went on, and at last she wandered out into the garden and began to play by herself under a tree near the veranda. She pretended that she was making a flower bed, and she stuck big scarlet hibiscus blossoms into little heaps of earth, all the time growing more and more angry and muttering to herself the things she would say and the names she would call Sadie when she returned. "Pig, pig, daughter of pigs," she said, because to call a native the pig is the worst insult of all. And she was grinding her teeth and saying this over and over again when she heard her mother come out on the veranda with someone. She was with a fair young man, and they stood talking together in low, strange voices. Mary knew the fair young man who looked like a boy. She had heard that he was a young officer who had just come from England. The child stared at him, but she stared most at her mother. She always did this when she had a chance to see her, because the Mem Sahib, Mary used to call her that oftener than anything else, was such a tall, slim, pretty person, and wore such lovely clothes. Her hair was like curly silk, and she had a delicate little nose which seemed to be disdaining things, and she had large, laughing eyes. All of her clothes were thin and floating, and Mary said that they were full of lace. They looked fuller of lace than ever this morning, but her eyes were not laughing at all. They were large and scared, and lifted imploringly to the fair boy officer's face. "Is it so very bad? Oh, is it?" Mary heard her say. "Awfully," the young man answered in a trembling voice. "Awfully, Miss Lennox. You ought to have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago." And the Mem Sahib wrung her hands. "Oh, I know I ought to. I only stayed to go to that silly dinner party. What a fool I was." And at that very moment such a loud sound of wailing broke out from the servants' quarters that she clutched the young man's arm, and Mary stood shivering from head to toe. The wailing grew wilder and wilder. "What is it? What is it?" "Someone has died. You did not say it had broken out among your servants." "I did not know. Come with me, come with me." And she turned and ran into the house. And after that appalling things happened, and the mysteriousness of the morning was explained to Mary. The cholera had broken out in its most fatal form, and people were dying like flies. The Aya had been taken ill in the night, and it was because she had just died that the servants had wailed in the huts. Before the next day, 3 other servants were dead, and others had run away in terror. There was panic on every side, and dying people in all the bungalows. During the confusion and bewilderment of the second day, Mary hid herself in the nursery, and was forgotten by everyone. Nobody thought of her, nobody wanted her, and strange things happened, of which she knew nothing. Mary alternately cried and slept through the hours. She only knew that people were ill, and that she heard mysterious and frightening sounds. Once she crept into the dining room, and found that it was empty, though a partly finished meal was on the table, and chairs and plates looked as if they had been hastily pushed back when the diners rose suddenly for some reason. The child ate some fruit and biscuits, and being thirsty she drank a glass of wine which stood nearly filled. It was sweet, and she didn't know how strong it was. Very soon it made her intensely drowsy, and she went back to her nursery and shut herself in again, frightened by cries she heard in the huts, and the hurrying sound of feet. The wine had made her so sleepy that she could scarcely keep her eyes open, and she would lay down on her bed and know nothing more for a long time. Many things happened during the hours in which she slept so heavily, but she wasn't disturbed by the walls and the sound of things being carried in and out of the bungalow. When she awakened, she lay and stared at the wall. The house was perfectly still. She'd never known it to be so silent before. She heard neither voices nor footsteps, and wondered if everybody had gotten well of the cholera, and all the trouble was over. She wondered also who would take care of her now that her Aya was dead. There would be a new Aya, and perhaps she would know some new stories. Mary had been rather tired of the old ones. She didn't cry because her nurse had died. She wasn't an affectionate child, and had never cared much for anyone. The noise and hurrying about and wailing over the cholera had frightened her, and she had been angry because no one seemed to remember that she was alive. Everyone was too panic-stricken to think of a little girl no one was fond of. When people had the cholera, it seemed they remembered nothing but themselves. But if everyone got well again, surely someone would remember and come to look for her. But no one came, and as she lay waiting, the house seemed to grow more and more silent. She heard something rustling on the matting, and when she looked down she saw a little snake gliding along and watching her with eyes like jewels. She wasn't frightened, because he was a harmless little thing who wouldn't hurt her, and he seemed in a hurry to get out of the room. He slipped under the door as she watched him. "How queer and quiet it is. It sounds as if there were no one in the bungalow but me and the snake." And almost the next minute she heard footsteps in the compound, and then on the veranda. They were men's footsteps, and the men entered the bungalow and talked in low voices. No one went to meet or speak to them, and they seemed to open doors and look into rooms. "What desolation! That pretty woman, I suppose, is a child too," I heard there was a child, and no one ever saw her. Mary was standing in the middle of the nursery when they opened the door a few minutes later. She looked an ugly, cross little thing and was frowning, because she was beginning to be hungry and feel disgracefully neglected. The first man who came in was a large officer she'd once seen talking to her father. He looked tired and troubled, but when he saw her he was so startled that he almost jumped back. "Barney, there's a child in here. A child alone in a place like this. Mercy on us, who is she?" "I am Mary Lennox," the little girl said, drawing herself up stiffly. She thought the man was very rude to call her father's bungalow a place like this. "I fell asleep when everybody had the cholera, and I've only just woke up. Why does nobody come?" "It's a child no one ever saw. She's actually been forgotten." "Why was I forgotten? Why does nobody come?" And Mary said this, stamping her foot. The young man, whose name was Barney, looked at her very sadly. Mary even thought she saw him wink his eyes as if to blink tears away. "Poor little kid, there's nobody left to come." And it was in that strange and sudden way that Mary found out that she had neither father nor mother left, that they had died and been carried away in the night, that the few native servants who had not died had also left the house as quickly as they could get out of it, none of them even remembering that there was a Missy Sahib. And that was why the place was so quiet. It was true that there was no one in the bungalow but herself and the little rustling snake. Chapter 2. Mistress Mary Quite Contrary. Mary had liked to look at her mother from a distance, and she'd thought her very pretty, but as she knew very little of her, she could scarcely have been expected to love her or miss her very much when she was gone. She didn't miss her at all, in fact, and as she was a self-absorbed child, she gave her entire thought to herself, as she had always done. If she had been older, she would have no doubt been very anxious at being left alone in the world, but she was very young, and as she had always been taken care of, she supposed she would always be. What she thought was that she would like to know if she was going to nice people who would be polite to her and give her her own way, as her ayah and the other native servants had done. She knew that she was not going to stay at the English clergyman's house, where she was taken at first. She didn't want to stay. The English clergyman was poor, and he had 5 children nearly all the same age, and they wore shabby clothes and were always quarreling and snatching toys from each other. Mary hated their untidy bungalow, and was so disagreeable to them that after the first day or two nobody would play with her. By the second day they'd given her a nickname which made her furious. It was Basil who thought of it first. Basil was a little boy with impudent blue eyes and a turned-up nose, and Mary hated him. She was playing by herself under a tree, just as she had been playing the day the cholera broke out. She was making heaps of earth and paths for a garden, and Basil came and stood near to watch her. Presently he got rather interested and suddenly made a suggestion. Why don't you put a heap of stones there and pretend it's a rockery, there in the middle?" And he leaned over her to point. "Go away, I don't want boys, go away." And for a moment Basil looked angry, and then he began to tease. He was always teasing his sisters. He danced round and round her, and made faces and sang and laughed. "Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow, with silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row?" And he sang it until the other children heard and laughed too, and the crosser Mary got, the more they sang Mistress Mary Quite Contrary. And after that, as long as she stayed with them, they called her Mistress Mary Quite Contrary when they spoke of her to each other, and often when they spoke to her. "You're going to be sent home at the end of the week, and we're glad of it," said Basil to her. "I'm glad of it too. Where is home?" "She doesn't know where home is," said Basil with a 7-year-old scorn. "It's England, of course. Our grandmamma lives there, and our sister Mabel was sent to her last year. You're not going to your grandmamma, you have none. You're going to your uncle. His name is Mr. Archibald Craven." "I don't know anything about him." "I know you don't. You don't know anything. Girls never do. I heard father and mother talking about him. He lives in a great big desolate old house in the country, and no one ever goes near him. He's so cross they won't let him, and they wouldn't come if you would let them. He's a hunchback, and he's horrid." "I don't believe you." and Mary turned her back and stuck her fingers in her ears because she wouldn't listen any more. But she thought over it a great deal afterward, and when Miss Crawford told her that night she was going to sail away to England in a few days, and go to her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, who lived at Misselthwaite Manor, she looked so stony and stubbornly uninterested that they didn't know what to think about her. They tried to be kind to her, but she only turned her face away when Mrs. Crawford attempted to kiss her, and held herself stiffly when Mr. Crawford patted her shoulder. "She's such a plain child," Crawford had said pityingly afterward, "and her mother was such a pretty creature. She always had a very pretty manner, too, and Mary has the most unattractive ways I ever saw in a child. The children call her Mistress Mary quite contrary, and though it's naughty of them, one can't help but understand it." "Perhaps if her mother had carried her pretty face and her pretty manners oftener into the nursery, Mary might have learned some pretty ways, too. It's very sad now the poor beautiful thing is gone, to remember that many people never even knew that she had a child at all." "I believe she was scarcely ever looked at ever," sighed Miss Crawford. "When her ayah was dead, there was no one to give a thought to the little thing. Think of the servants running away and leaving her all alone in that deserted bungalow. Colonel McGrew said he nearly jumped out of his skin when he opened the door and found her standing by herself in the middle of the room." And Mary made the long voyage to England under the care of an officer's wife, who was taking her children to leave them in a boarding school. She was very much absorbed in her own little boy and girl, and she was very glad to hand the child over to the woman Mr. Archibald Craven sent to meet her in London. I lost my place. 1 moment. The woman was his housekeeper at Misselthwaite Manor, and her name was Miss Medlock. She was a stout woman with very red cheeks and sharp black eyes. She wore a very purple dress, a black silk mantle with jet fringe on it, and a black bonnet with purple velvet flowers, which stuck up and trembled when she moved her head. Mary didn't like her at all, but as she very seldom liked people, there was nothing remarkable in that. Besides which, it was very evident Miss Medlock did not think much of her. "My word, she's a plain little piece of goods," she had said, "and we'd heard that her mother was a beauty. She hasn't handed much of it down, has she, ma'am?" Perhaps she'll improve as she grows older," the officer's wife said good-naturedly. "If she were not so sallow and had a nicer expression, her features are rather good. Children alter so much." "She'll have to alter a good deal, and there's nothing likely to improve children at Misselthwaite, if you ask me." They thought Mary wasn't listening because she was standing a little apart from them at the window of the private hotel they'd gone to. She was watching the passing buses and cabs and people, but she heard quite well and was made very curious about her uncle and the place he lived in. What sort of place was it? What would he be like? What was a hunchback? She'd never seen one. Perhaps there were none in India. Since she'd been living in other people's houses and had had no ayah, she'd begun to feel lonely and to think strange thoughts which were new to her. She'd begun to wonder why she never seemed to belong to anyone, even when her mother and father had been alive. Other children seemed to belong to their mothers and fathers, but she'd never seemed to be anyone's little girl. She'd had servants and food and clothes, but no one had taken any notice of her. She didn't know that this was because she was a disagreeable child, but then, of course, she didn't know she was disagreeable. She often thought that other people were, but she didn't know that she was so herself. She thought Miss Medlock the most disagreeable person she'd ever seen, with her common, highly colored face and her common, fine bonnet. When the next day they set out on their journey to Yorkshire, she walked through the station to the railway carriage with her head up and trying to keep as far away as possible from her, because she didn't want to seem to belong to her. It would have made her angry to think people imagined she was her little girl. But Miss Medlock was not in the least disturbed by her and her thoughts. She was the kind of woman who would stand no nonsense from young ones. At least that's what she would have said if she had been asked. She had not wanted to go to London when her sister Maria's daughter was going to be married, but she had a comfortable, well-paid place as a housekeeper, at Misselthwaite Manor, and the only way in which she was to keep it was to do at once what Mr. Archibald Craven told her to do. She never dared even to ask a question.
Captain Lennox and his wife died of the cholera,
Mr. Craven had said in his short, cold way.
Captain Lennox was my wife's brother, and I am their daughter's guardian. The child is to be brought here. You must go to London and bring her yourself.
So she packed her small trunk and made the journey. Mary sat in her corner of the railway carriage and looked plain and fretful. She had nothing to read or to look at, and she had folded her thin little black-gloved hands in her lap. Her black dress made her look yellower than ever, and her limp light hair struggled out from under a black crape hat. "A more marred-looking young one I never saw in my life," Miss Medlock thought. Marred is a Yorkshire word, means spoiled and prettish. She'd never seen a child who sat so still without doing anything, and at last she got tired of watching her and began to talk in a brisk, hard voice. "I suppose I may as well tell you about something where you're going to. Do you know anything about your uncle?" "No." "Never heard your mother and father talk about him?" "No," Mary had said, frowning, and she frowned because she remembered that her father and mother had never talked to her about anything in particular. Certainly they never told her things. Muttered Medlock, staring at her queer, unresponsive little face. She didn't say any more for a few moments, and then she began again. "I suppose you might as well be told something to prepare you. You're going to a strange place." And Mary had said nothing at all. Miss Medlock looked rather discomfited by her apparent indifference, but after taking a breath she went on. "Not that it's a grand big place in a gloomy way, and Mr. Craven's proud of it in his way, and that's gloomy enough too. But the house is 600 years old, it's on the edge of a moor, and there's 100 rooms in it, if not more. Most of them are shut up and locked, and there's pictures and fine old furnitures and things that have been there for ages. There's a big park round it, and gardens and trees with branches trailing to the ground, with some of them." And she paused and took a breath. "But there's nothing else." Mary had begun to listen in spite of herself. It all sounded so unlike India, and anything new rather attracted her. But she didn't intend to look as if she were interested. That was one of her unhappy, disagreeable ways. And so she sat still. "Well, what do you think of it?" "Nothing. I know nothing about such places." And that made Miss Medlock laugh a short sort of laugh. "You're like an old woman, don't you care?" "It doesn't matter whether I care or not." "You're right enough there, it doesn't. What you ought to be kept at Misselthwaite Manor for, I don't know, unless because it's the easiest way. He's not going to trouble himself about you, that's for sure and certain. He never troubles himself about anyone." And she stopped herself as if she'd just remembered something in time. "He's got a crooked back. That set him wrong. He was a sour young man and got no good of all his money in a big place until he was married." And Mary's eyes, turned toward her in spite of intention, did not seem to care. She'd never thought of the hunchback's being married, and she was a trifle surprised. Medlock saw this, and as she was a talkative woman, she continued with more interest. This was one way of passing some of the time, at any rate. "She was a sweet, pretty thing, and he'd have walked the world over to get her a blade of grass she wanted. Nobody thought she'd marry him, but she did, and people said she married him for his money. But she didn't. When she died—" And Mary gave a little involuntary jump. "Oh, did she die?" she exclaimed, quite without meaning to. She just remembered a French fairy tale that she'd once read called Riquet à la Haute. It had been about a poor hunchback and a beautiful princess, and it made her suddenly sorry for Archibald Craven. "Yes, she died, and it made him queerer than ever. He cares about nobody. He won't see people. Most of the time he goes away, and when he's at Misselthwaite he shuts himself up in the west wing, won't let anybody but Pitcher see him. Pitcher's an old fellow, but he took care of him when he was a child, and he knows his ways." It sounded like something in a book, and it didn't make Mary feel cheerful. A house with 100 rooms, nearly all shut up, and with her doors locked. A house on the edge of a moor? Whatsoever a moor was, it sounded dreary. A man with a crooked back who shut himself up. She stared out of the window with her lips pinched together, and it seemed quite natural that the rain should have begun to pour down in grey slanting lines and splash and stream down the window panes. If the pretty wife had been alive, she might have made things cheerful by being something like her own mother, and by running in and out and going to parties as she'd done in frocks full of lace. But she wasn't there any more. "You needn't expect to see him, because 10 to 1 you won't, and you mustn't expect that there'll be people to talk to you. You'll have to play about and look after yourself. You'll be told what rooms you can go into and what rooms you're to keep out of. There's gardens enough, but when you're poking about the house, don't go wandering and, that sort of thing. Mr. Craven won't have it." "I won't want to go poking about," said sour little Mary, and just as suddenly as she had begun to feel rather sorry for Craven, she began to cease to be sorry and to think he was unpleasant enough to deserve all that had happened to him. Then she turned her face toward the streaming panes of the window of the railway carriage and gazed out at the grey rainstorm, which looked as if it would go on forever and ever. She watched it so long and steadily that the greyness grew heavier and heavier before her eyes, and she fell asleep. Chapter 3. Across the Moor. She slept a long time, and when she awakened, Miss Medlock had brought a lunch basket at one of the stations, and they had some chicken and cold beef and bread and butter and some hot tea. The rain seemed to be streaming down more heavily than ever, and everybody in the station wore wet and glistening waterproofs. The guard lit the lamps in the carriage, and Miss Medlock cheered up very much over her tea and chicken and beef. She ate a great deal, and afterwards fell asleep herself, and Mary sat and stared at her and watched her fine bonnet slip on one side until she herself fell asleep once more in the corner of the carriage, lulled by the splashing of the rain against the windows. It was quite dark when she awakened again. The train had stopped at a station, and Miss Medlock was shaking her. "You've had a sleep. It's time to open your eyes. We're at Thwaite Station. We've got a long drive before us." Mary stood up and tried to keep her eyes open, while Miss Medlock collected her parcels. The little girl didn't offer to help her, because in India native servants had always picked up or carried things, and it seemed quite proper that other people should wait on one. The station was a small one, and nobody but themselves seemed to be getting out of the train. The station master spoke to Miss Medlock in a rough, good-natured way, pronouncing his words in a strange, broad fashion, which Mary found out afterward was Yorkshire. "I see they got back, and that's bad the younger thee." "Ah, that's her," answered Medlock, speaking with a Yorkshire accent herself, and jerking her head over her shoulder toward Mary. "How's the missus?" "Well enough. Carriage is waiting outside for you." Listen, I know that's not a Yorkshire accent, but my Yorkshire accent is really, really bad, so we're just gonna go with that. A brougham stood on the road before the little outside platform. Mary saw that it was a smart carriage, and that it was a smart footman who helped her in. His long waterproof coat and the waterproof covering of his hat were shining and dripping with rain, as everything was, the burly station-master included. When he shut the door, mounted the box with the coachman, and they drove off, the little girl found herself seated in a comfortably cushioned corner. But she was not inclined to go to sleep again. She sat and looked out of the window, curious to see something of the road over which she was being driven to the strange place Miss Medlock had spoken of. She was not at all a timid child, and she wasn't exactly frightened, but she felt that there was no knowing what might happen in a house with 100 rooms and nearly all of them shut up, a house standing on the edge of a moor. "What's a moor?" she said suddenly to Miss Medlock. "Well, look out the window in about 10 minutes and you'll see. We've got to drive 5 miles across Missel Moor before we get to the manor. You won't see much because it's a dark night, but you can see something." And Mary asked no more questions, but waited in the darkness of her corner, keeping her eyes on the window. The carriage lamps cast rays of light a little distance ahead of them, and she caught glimpses of the things they passed. After they'd left the station, they'd driven through a tiny village, and she'd seen whitewashed cottages and lights of a public house. Then they passed a church and a vicarage, and a little shop window or two, in a cottage with toys and sweets and odd things set out for sale. Then they were on the high road, and she saw hedges and trees. After that there seemed nothing different for a long time, or at least it seemed a long time to her. At last the horses began to go more slowly, as if they were climbing uphill, and presently there seemed to be no more hedges and no more trees. She could see nothing, in fact, but a dense darkness on either side. She leaned forward and pressed her face against the window just as the carriage gave a big jolt. "Well, we're on the moor now, sure enough." And the carriage lamp shed a yellow light on a rough-looking road which seemed to be cut through bushes and low-growing things, which ended in the great expanse of dark apparently spread out before and around them. A wind was rising and making a singular, wild, low, rushing sound. It's not the sea, is it?" "No, it isn't. Nor isn't it fields or mountains. It's just miles and miles of wild land that nothing grows on but heather and gorse and broom, but nothing lives on but wild ponies and sheep." "I feel as if it might be the sea if there were water on it. It sounds like the sea just now." "There's the wind blowing through the bushes. It's a wild, dreary place to my mind, though there's plenty that likes it, particularly when the heather's in bloom." On and on they drove through the darkness, and though the rain stopped, the wind rushed by and whistled and made strange sounds. The road went up and down, and several times the carriage passed over a little bridge beneath which water rushed very fast with a great deal of noise. Mary felt as if the drive would never come to an end, that the wide, bleak moor was a wide expanse of black ocean through which she was passing on a strip of dry land. "I don't like it," she said to herself. "I don't like it." And she pinched her thin lips more tightly together. The horses were climbing up a hilly piece of road when she first caught sight of a light. Miss Medlock saw it as soon as she did, and drew a long sigh of relief. "Oh, my glad to see that bit of light twinkling. It's the light in the lodge window. We'll get a good cup of tea after a bit, at all events." And it was after a bit, as she said, for when the carriage passed through the park gates, and there was still 2 miles of avenue to drive through, and the trees, which nearly met overhead, made it seem as if they were driving through a long, dark vault. They drove out of the vault into a clear space, and stopped before an immensely long but low-built house, which seemed to ramble around a stone court. At first Mary thought that there were no lights at all in the windows, but as she got out of the carriage she saw that one room in a corner upstairs showed a dull glow. The entrance door was a huge one, made of massive, curiously shaped panels of oak, studded with big iron nails and bound with great iron bars. It opened into an enormous hall, which was so dimly lighted that the faces and the portraits on the walls and the figures in the suits of armor made Mary feel that she didn't want to look at them. And as she stood on the stone floor, she looked a very small, odd little black figure, and she felt as small and lost and odd as she looked. A neat, thin old man stood near the manservant who opened the door for them.
"You are to take her to her room. He doesn't want to see her. He's going to London in the morning,"
he said in a husky voice.
"Very well, Mr. Pitcher. So long as I know what's expected of me, I can manage."
"What's expected of you, Miss Medlock, is that you make sure he's not disturbed and that he doesn't see what he doesn't want to see."
And then Mary Lennox was led up a broad staircase and down a long corridor and up a short flight of steps and through another corridor and another, until a door opened in a wall, and she found herself in a room with fire in it and a supper on the table. And Miss Medlock said unceremoniously,
"Well, here you are. This room and the next are where you'll live, and you must keep to them. Don't forget that."
And it was in this way that Mistress Mary arrived at Misselthwaite Manor, and she had perhaps never felt so quite so contrary in her life. Chapter 4. Martha. When she opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire, and was kneeling on the hearthrug raking out the cinders noisily. Mary lay and watched her for a few moments, then began to look about the room. She'd never seen a room at all like it, and thought it was curious and gloomy. The walls were covered with tapestry, with a forest scene embroidered on it. There were fantastically dressed people under the trees, and in the distance there was a glimpse of the turrets of a castle. There were hunters and horses and dogs and ladies. Mary felt as if she were in a forest with them. Out of a deep window she could see a great climbing stretch of land, which seemed to have no trees on it, and it looked a bit like our endless, dull, purplish sea. "What's that?" And Martha, the young housemaid, who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there?" "Yes, that's the moor. Does you like it?" "No, I hate it." "That's because you are not used to it." And Martha said this, turning back to her hearth. "I thinks it too big and bare now, but you like it." "Do you?" "Ah, that I do," answered Martha, cheerfully polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's none bare. It's covered with growing things, and they smell sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer, and the gorse and the broom and the heathers and flower. It smells of honey, and there's just such a lot of fresh air, and the sky looks so high, and the bees and skylarks make such a nice noise, humming and singing. Oh, I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary listened to her with a grave, puzzled expression. The servants she had been used to in India were not the least like this. They were obsequious and servile, and didn't presume to talk to their masters as if they were equals. They made salams and called them protector of the poor, and names of that sort. Servants were commanded to do things, not asked. It wasn't the custom to say please and thank you, and Mary had always slapped her Hay in the face when she was angry. She wondered a little what this girl would do if one slapped her in the face. She was a round, rosy, good-natured looking creature, but she had a sturdy way which made Mistress Mary wonder if she might not even slap back, if the person who slapped her was only a little girl. "You're a strange servant," she said from her pillows rather haughtily, and Martha sat up on her heels with her blacking brush in her hand and laughed without seeming the least bit out of temper. "Oh, I know that. If there was a grand missus at Misselthwaite, I should never have been even one of the under housemaids. I might never have been let to be scullery maid, but I'd definitely never have been let upstairs. I'm too common, and I talk too much Yorkshire. But this is a funny house for all it's so grand. Seems like there's neither a master nor a mistress except Mr. Pitcher and Miss Medlock. Mr. Craven, he won't be troubled about anything when he's here, and he's always away. Miss Medlock gave me the place out of kindness. She told me she'd never done it if Misselthwaite had been like any other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked, still in her imperious little Indian way, and Martha began to rub her grate again. "I'm Miss Medlock's servant, and she's Mr. Craven's, but I'm to do the housemaid's work and up here and wait on you a bit. But you won't need much waiting on." "Who's going to dress me?" And Martha sat up on her heels again and stared. She spoke in a broad Yorkshire because of her amazement. "I can dress yourself, then." "What do you mean? I don't understand your language." "Ah, I forgot. Miss Medlock told me I'd have to be careful you wouldn't know what I was saying. I mean you can't put on your own clothes?"
No, I never did in my life. My ayah dressed me, of course.
Well, said Martha, evidently not in the least aware that she was impudent,
it's time you should learn. You can't begin younger. It'll do you good to wait on yourself a bit. My mother always said she couldn't see why grand people's children didn't turn out fair fools, what with nurses had been washed and dressed and took out to walk as if they were dogs. It is different in India,
said Mistress Mary disdainfully. She could scarcely stand all this. But Martha was not at all crushed.
Yeah, I can see it's different. Yeah, I say it's because there's such a lot of, well, irreputable folks. When I heard you was coming from India, I thought you were going to be, well, irreputable too.
And Mary sat up in bed, furious.
What? You thought I was a native? You daughter of a pig?
And Martha stared and looked hot.
Who you calling names? You needn't be so vexed. It's not the way for a young lady to talk. I got nothing against Susie. people of ill repute, when you read about 'em in tracts, they're always very religious. I always read well, they're men's brothers. I ain't never seen. I was fair pleased to think I was going to see one up close. Well, when I come to light your fire this morning, I crept up to your bed, pulled the cover back careful to look at you, and there you was. No darker than me for all you're so yaller.
I'll take sections of the book that didn't age well for 500. Mary didn't even try to control her rage and humiliation.
You thought I was a native. You dared. You don't know anything about natives. They're not people. They're servants who must salaam to you. You know nothing about India. You know nothing about anything.
And she was in such a rage and felt so helpless before the girl's simple stare. Somehow she suddenly felt so horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood and which understood her, that she threw herself face downward on the pillows and burst into passionate sobbing. She sobbed so unrestrainedly the good-natured Yorkshire Martha was a little frightened and quite sorry for her. She went to the bed and bent over her.
You mustn't cry like that here. You mustn't for sure. I didn't know you'd be vexed. I didn't know anything about anything. It's like you said. I beg your pardon. You do stop crying.
There was something comforting and really friendly in her strange Yorkshire speech and sturdy way which had a good effect on Mary. She gradually ceased crying and became quiet, and Martha looked relieved.
It's time for you to get up now. Miss Medlock says I was to carry the breakfast and tea and dinner in the next room to this. It's been made into a nursery. I'll help you with the clothes if you can't get out, if that'll get you out of bed. The buttons are at the back. You can't button up yourself anyway.
And when Mary at last decided to get up, the clothes Martha took from the wardrobe were not the ones she had worn when she arrived the night before with Miss Medlock.
Those are not mine. Mine are black.
And she looked at the thick white wool coat and dressed over and added with cool approval,
Those are nicer than mine. These are the ones you must put on, Martha answered. Mr. Craven ordered Miss Medlock to get 'em in London. He said I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul. He said, it makes the place sadder than it is. Put color on her. Mother always said she knew what she meant. Mother always said knows what a body means. She doesn't hold with that color herself. I hate dark things.
And the dressing process which was one that taught them both something. Martha had buttoned up her little brothers and sisters, but she'd never seen a child who stood still and waited for another person to do things for her, as if she had neither had hands or feet of her own.
Why doesn't you put on your own shoes?
When Mary quietly held out her foot.
My ayah did it. It was the custom.
And she said that very often. It was the custom. The servants were always saying it. If one told them to do a thing their ancestors had not done for 1,000 years, they gazed at one mildly and said, It is not the custom, and one knew that was the end of the matter. It hadn't been the custom that Mistress Mary should do anything but stand and allow herself to be dressed like a doll, but before she was ready for breakfast she began to suspect that her life at Misselthwaite Manor would end by teaching her a number of things quite new to her. Things such as putting on her own shoes and stockings, and picking up things she let fall. If Martha had been a well-trained, fine young lady's maid, she would have been more subservient and respectful, and would have known that it was her business to brush hair and button boots and pick things up and lay them away. She was, however, only an untrained Yorkshire rustic, who had been brought up in a moorland cottage with a swarm of little brothers and sisters, who'd never dreamed of doing anything but waiting on themselves and on the younger ones who were either babies in arms or just learning to totter about and tumble over things. If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk, but Mary only listened to her coldly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she wasn't at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, homely way, Mary began to notice what she was saying.
Oh, you should see 'em all. There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shillings a week. I can tell you my mother puts it to getting porridge for 'em all. They tumble about on the moor and play there all day, and father says the air of the moor fattens them. Says she believes they eat the grass same as wild ponies do. Oh, our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he's got a young pony he calls his own.
Where did he get it?
He found it on the moor with his mother when he was a little one, and began to make friends with it, give it bits of bread, pluck young grass for it. They got to like him, so it follows him about and lets him get on his back. Dickon's a kind lad, animals likes him."
And Mary had never possessed an animal pet of her own, and always thought she would like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she had never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. When she went into the room which had been made into a nursery for her, she found that it was rather like the one she had slept in. It wasn't a child's room, but a grown-up person's room, with gloomy old pictures on the walls and heavy dark oak chairs. A table in the center was set with a good substantial breakfast. She had always had a very small appetite, and she looked with something more than indifference at the first plate Martha set it before her.
"I don't want it." "It doesn't want your porridge?"
"No."
You don't know how good it is. Put a bit of treacle on it or a bit of sugar."
"I don't want it."
"Well, I can't abide to see good victuals go to waste. If our children was at the table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes."
"Why?"
"Why? 'Cause they scarce had their stomachs full in their lives. They're hungry as young hawks and foxes."
"I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary with the indifference of ignorance. And Martha looked indignant.
"It'd do you good to try it. I can see that plain enough. I got no patience with folk that just sits and stares at good bread and meat. My word, I don't. I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane and the rest of 'em had a seer under their pinafores."
"Why don't you take it to them?"
"It's not mine, and this isn't my day out. Get my day out once a month, same as the rest. Then I go home and clean up for mother, give her a day's rest."
And Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast and some marmalade.
"You wrap up good and go out and play. It'll do you good and give you some stomach for the meat."
And Mary went to the window. There were gardens and paths and big trees, but everything looked dull and wintry. "Out? Why should I go out on a day like this?"
"Well, if it doesn't go out, you have to stay in, and what's that? What you got doing here?"
Mary glanced about her. There was nothing to do. When Miss Medlock had prepared the nursery, she had not thought of amusement. Perhaps it would be better to go and see what the gardens were like.
"Who will go with me?"
And Martha stared.
"You'll go by yourself. You gotta learn to play like other children does when they haven't got sisters and brothers. Dickon goes off on the moor by himself, plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony. He got sheep on the moor to know him, and birds that comes and eats out of his hand. However little there is to eat, he always saves a bit out of his bread to coax his pets."
And it was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she wasn't aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there wouldn't be ponies or sheep. They would look different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Martha found her coat and hat for her, and a pair of stout little boots, and she showed her way downstairs.
"If you go around, you'll come away to the gardens," she said, pointing to a gate in the wall of shrubbery. "There's lots of flowers in summertime, but nothing's blooming right now."
And she seemed to hesitate a second before she added,
"One of the gardens is locked up. Nobody's been in it for 10 years.
"Why?" And here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house.
"Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He wouldn't let anyone go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole, buried the key. There's Miss Medlock's bell ringing. I must run."
And after she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. She couldn't help thinking about the garden which no one had been into for 10 years. She wondered what it would look like, and whether there were any flowers still alive in it. When she had passed through the shrubbery gate, she found herself in great gardens, with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders. There were trees and flower beds and evergreens clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old gray fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. This wasn't the garden which was shut up. How could a garden be shut up? You could always walk into a garden. She was just thinking this when she saw that, at the end of the path that she was following, there seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She wasn't familiar enough with England to know that she was coming upon the kitchen gardens, where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went toward the wall and found that there was a green door in the ivy, and that it stood open.
This wasn't the closed garden, evidently, and she could go into it. She went through the door and found that it was a garden with walls all round it, and it was only one of several walled gardens which seemed to open into each other. She saw another open green door revealing bushes and pathways between beds containing winter vegetables. Fruit trees were trained flat against the wall, and over some of the beds there were glass frames. The place was bare and ugly enough, Mary thought, as she stood and stared about her. It must be nicer in summer when things were green, but there was nothing pretty about it right now. Presently an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door leading from the second garden, and he looked startled when he saw Mary, then touched his cap. He had a surly old face, and didn't seem at all pleased to see her, but she was displeased with his garden, and wore a quite contrary expression, certainly didn't seem at all pleased to see him. "What is this place?"
"One of the kitchen gardens,"
"What is that?" said Mary, pointing through the green door.
"Another of 'em. There's another on the other side of that wall, and there's the orchard on the other side of that."
"Can I go in them?"
"If you like, but there's nothing to see."
And Mary made no response. She went down the path and through the second green door. There she found more walls and winter vegetables and glass frames, but in the second wall there was another green door, and it wasn't open. Perhaps it led to the garden which no one had seen for 10 years. As she was not at all a timid child, and always did what she wanted to do, Mary went to the green door and turned the handle. She hoped the door would not open, because she wanted to be sure she had found the mysterious garden, but it opened quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. There were walls all around it also, and trees trained against them, and there were bare fruit trees growing in the winter-browned grass, but there was no green door to be seen anywhere. Mary looked for it, and yet when she entered the upper end of the garden, she had noticed that the wall did not seem to end with the orchard, but to extend beyond it, as if it enclosed a place at the other side. She could see the tops of trees above the wall, and when she stood still she saw a bird with a bright red chest, sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. She stopped and listened to him, and somehow his cheerful, friendly little whistle gave her a pleased feeling. Even a disagreeable little girl may be lonely, and the big closed house and the big bare moor and the big bare gardens had made this one feel as if there was no one left in the world but herself. If she'd been an affectionate child who had been used to being loved, she'd have broken her heart, but even though she was Mistress Mary quite contrary, she was a desolate, and the bright-breasted little bird had brought a look into her sour little face which was almost a smile. She listened to him until he flew away. He wasn't like an Indian bird, and she liked him, and wondered if she should ever see him again. Perhaps he lived in the mysterious garden, and knew all about it. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatsoever to do that she thought so much of the deserted garden. She was curious about it, and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Craven buried the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She wondered if she should ever see him, but she knew that if she did, she shouldn't like him, and he would not like her, and that she should only stand and stare at him and say nothing, though she should be wanting dreadfully to ask him why he had done such a strange thing. "People never like me, and I never like people, and I can never talk as the Crawford children could. They were always talking and laughing and making noises," she thought. And she thought of the robin, and of the way he seemed to sing his song at her, and she remembered the tree-top he perched on. She stopped rather suddenly on the path. "I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was. There was a wall round the place, and there was no door." She walked back into the first kitchen garden she had entered, and found the old man digging there. She went and stood beside him, and watched him a few moments in her cold little way. He took no notice of her, and so at last she spoke to him. "I have been into the other gardens."
"There was nothing to prevent you."
"I went into the orchard."
"There was no dog at the door to bite you."
"There was no door there into the other garden."
"What garden?"
he said in a rough voice, stopping his digging for a moment.
The one on the other side of the wall. There are trees there. I saw the tops of one of them, and a bird with a red breast was sitting on one, and he sang.
And to her surprise, the surly old weather-beaten face actually changed its expression. A slow smile spread over it, and the gardener looked quite different. It made her think that it was curious how much nicer a person looked when he smiled. She hadn't thought of it before. He turned about to the orchard side of his garden and began to whistle, a low, soft whistle. She couldn't understand how such a surly man could make such a coaxing sound. Almost the next moment, a wonderful thing happened. She heard a soft little rushing flight through the air, and it was the bird with the red breast flying to them, and he actually alighted on the big clod of earth quite near the gardener's foot.
"There he is,"
chuckled the old man, and then he spoke to the bird as if he were speaking to a child.
"Where you been, you cheeky little beggar? I haven't seen you before today. Has you begun courting this early in the season? That's right."
The bird put his tiny head to one side and looked up at him with his soft, bright eye, which was like a black dewdrop. He seemed quite familiar, and not the least afraid, and he hopped about, pecking the earth briskly, looking for seeds and insects. It actually gave Mary a strange feeling in her heart, because he was so pretty and cheerful, and seemed so much like a person. He had a tiny, plump body, and a delicate beak, and slender, delicate legs.
Will he always come when you call him?
Well, that he will. I've known him since ever was a fledgling. He come out of the nest in the other garden, and when he first flew over the wall, he was too weak to fly back for a few days, being out friendly. When he went over the wall again, the rest of the brood is gone, and he's lonely, so he came back to me.
What kind of a bird is he?
Don't you know? He's a robin redbreast, the friendliest, curious birds alive. Almost as friendly as dogs, if you know how to get on with him. Watch him becking about there, looking around at us now and again. He knows we're talking about him.
And it was the strangest thing in the world to see the old fellow. He looked at the plump, little scarlet waistcoated bird as if he were both proud and fond of him. He's a conceited one, likes to hear folks talk about him. And curious, bless me, there never was any like for curious and meddling. He's always coming to see what I'm planting, and those all the things Mr. Craven never troubles himself to find out. He's head gardener, he is. And the robin hopped about, busily pecking the soil now and again, and stopped and looked at them a little. Mary thought his black dewdrop eyes gazed at her with great curiosity. It really seemed as if they were finding all out about her. The queer feeling in her heart increased.
Where did the rest of the brood fly to?
Don't know it. Old ones turn 'em out of the nest and make 'em fly, and they're scattered before you know it. This one is knowing, and he knew he was lonely.
Mistress Mary went a step closer to the robin and looked at him very hard.
I'm lonely.
She hadn't known before that this was one of the things that made her feel sour and cross. She seemed to find it out when the robin looked at her, and she looked at the robin. And the old gardener pushed his cap back on his bald head and stared at her for a moment.
Are you a little wench from India?
And Mary nodded.
And no wonder you're lonely. It'll be lonely for us, time.
And he began to dig again, driving his spade deep into the rich black garden soil, while the robin hopped about very busily employed.
What's your name?
Then he stood up to answer her.
Ben Weatherstaff,
he answered, and then he added with a surly chuckle,
I'm lonely myself, except when he's with me.
And he jerked his thumb toward the robin.
He's the only friend I got.
I have no friends at all. I never had. My ayah didn't like me, and I never played with anyone.
It's a Yorkshire habit to say what you think with blunt frankness, and old Ben Weatherstaff was a Yorkshire moorman.
Then you and me are a good bit alike, wove out of the same cloth. We're neither of us good looking. We're both as sour as we look. We got some nasty tempers, both of us, I'd warrant.
And this was plain speaking. Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Servants always salaamed and submitted to you, whatever you did. She never thought much about her looks, but she wondered if she was as unattractive as Ben Weatherstaff, and she also wondered if she looked as sour as he had looked before the robin had come. She began to wonder also if she was nastily tempered, and felt uncomfortable. Suddenly a clear, rippling little sound broke out near her, and she turned round. She was standing a few feet from a young apple tree, and the robin had flown onto one of its branches and burst out into a scrap of a song. Weatherstaff had laughed outright.
"What did he do that for?"
"He's made up his mind to make friends with you. Dang it if he hasn't taken a fancy to you."
"To me?"
said Mary, and she moved toward the little tree softly and looked up.
"Would you make friends with me?"
she said to the robin as if she was speaking to a person.
"Would you?"
And she didn't say it either in her hard little voice or in her imperious Indian voice, but in a tone so soft and eager and coaxing that Weatherstaff was as surprised as she had been when she heard him whistle.
"Why, that was said nice and human, as if she were a real child instead of a sharp old woman. This is almost like Dickon talks to his wild things on the moor."
"Do you know Dickon?"
Mary asked, turning around rather in a hurry.
"Everybody knows him. Dickon's wandering about everywhere. Very blackberries and heather bells know him. Warren the foxes shows him where their cubs lies, and the skylarks don't hide their nests from him."
Mary would have liked to ask more questions. She was almost as curious about Dickon as she was about the deserted garden. But just that little moment, the robin who had ended his song gave a shake of his wings, spread them, and flew away. He'd made his visit and had other things to do.
"He's flown over the wall,"
Mary cried out, watching him.
"He's flown into the orchard. He's flown across the other wall, in the garden where there's no door."
"Well, he lives there. Came out of the egg there. If he's courting, he's making up some young madam or robin that lives among the old rose trees there."
"Rose trees? Are there rose trees?"
Ben Weatherstaff took up his spade again and began to dig.
"There was 10 years ago."
"I should like to see them. Where's the green door? There must be a door somewhere."
Ben drove his spade deep and looked as uncompanionable as he had looked when she'd first seen him.
"Was 10 years ago, there wasn't now."
"No door? There must be."
"None as anyone can find, and none as anyone's business. Don't you be a meddlesome wench, poke your nose where it's no cause to go. Now I gotta get to work. Get on playing. I ain't got no more time."
And he actually stopped digging, threw his spade over his shoulder, and walked off without even glancing at her, and saying goodbye. Chapter 5. The Cry in the Corridor. At first, each day which passed by for Mary Lennox was exactly like the others. Every morning she awoke in her tapestried room, and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth, building her fire. Every morning she ate her breakfast in the nursery, which had nothing amusing in it, and after each breakfast she gazed out to the window, across the huge moor which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky, and after she'd stared out for a while, she realized that if she didn't go out she'd have to stay in and do nothing, and so she went out. She didn't know that this was the best thing she could have done, and she didn't know that when she began to walk quickly or even run along the paths and down the avenue, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger by fighting with the wind, which swept down from the moor. She ran only to make herself warm, and she hated the wind that rushed at her face and roared and held her back as if it were some giant she could not see. But the big breaths of rough, fresh air blown over the heather filled her lungs with something which was good for her whole thin body, and whipped some red color into her cheeks, and brightened her dull eyes when she didn't know anything about it. But after a few days, spent almost entirely out of doors, she wakened one morning not knowing what it was to be hungry. But after a few days spent almost entirely out of doors, she wakened one morning knowing what it was to be hungry, and when she sat down to her breakfast she didn't glance disdainfully at her porridge and pushed it away, but took up her spoon and began to eat it, and continued to eat it, until the bowl was empty.
"Well, that got on well enough with it this morning, didn't you?"
"It tastes nice today,"
said Mary, feeling a little surprised on herself.
If it's the air of the moors giving you stomach for the victuals, it's lucky for these that's got victuals as well as appetite. There's been 12 in our cottage's stomach and nothing put in it. You go out and play out of doors every day, you get some flesh on your bones, you won't be so yaller. I don't play, I have nothing to play with. Nothing to play with? Our children plays with sticks and stones. They just runs about and shouts and looks at things.
Mary didn't shout, but she sure did look at things. There was nothing else to do. She walked round and round the gardens and wandered about the paths in the park. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but though several times she saw him at work, he was too busy to look at her, or he was too surly. Once, when she was walking toward him, he picked up his spade and turned away as if he did it on purpose. One place she went to oftener than any other. It was the long walk outside the gardens with the walls round them. There were bare flower beds on either side of it, and against the walls the ivy grew thickly. There was one part of the wall where the creeping dark green leaves were more bushy than elsewhere. It seemed as if for a long time that part had been neglected. The rest had been clipped and made to look neat, but this lower end of the walk hadn't been trimmed at all. A few days after she had talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary stopped to notice this and wondered why it was so. She had just paused and was looking up at a long spray of ivy swinging in the wind when she saw a gleam of scarlet and heard a brilliant chirp. And there at the top of the wall perched Ben Weatherstaff's robin, tilting forward to look at her with his small head on one side. "Oh, is that you? Is that you?" And it didn't seem at all queer to her that she spoke to him as if she were sure he could understand and answer her. And he did answer. He twittered and chirped and hopped along the wall as if he were telling her all sorts of things. It seemed to Mistress Mary as if she understood him too, though she wasn't speaking in words. It was as if he said, "Good morning. Isn't the wind nice? Isn't the sun nice? Isn't everything nice? Let us both hop and chirp and twitter. Come on, come on." And Mary began to laugh, and as he hopped and took little flights along the wall, she ran after him. Poor little thin, sallow, ugly Mary. She actually looked almost pretty for a moment. I like you, she cried out, pattering down the walk, and she chirped and tried to whistle, which last she didn't know how to do the least. But the robin seemed to be quite satisfied, and chirped and whistled back at her. At last he spread his wings and made a darting flight to the top of a tree, where he perched and sang loudly. At last, I already read that line. That reminded Mary of the first time she'd seen him. He'd been swinging on a treetop, and she'd been standing in the orchard. And now she was on the other side of the orchard, and standing in the path outside a wall, much lower down, and there was the same tree inside. "It's the garden that no one can go into," she said to herself. "It's the garden without a door. He lives in there. How I wish I could see what it was like." And she ran up the walk to the green door she'd entered the first morning. Then she ran down the path through the other door, and then into the orchard, and when she stood and looked up, there was the tree on the other side of the wall. There was the robin just finishing his song and beginning to preen his feathers with his beak. "It's the garden. I'm sure it is." And she walked round and looked closely at the side of the orchard wall, but she only found what she had found before, that there was no door in it. Then she ran through the kitchen gardens again and out into the walk outside along the ivy-coloured wall. And she walked to the end of it and looked at it, but there was no door. Then she walked to the other end, looking again, but there was no door. "It's very queer. Ben Weatherstaff said there was no door, and there is no door, but there must have been one 10 years ago, because Mr. Craven buried the key." This gave her so much to think of that she began to be quite interested, and feel that she was not sorry she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India she'd always felt hot and too languid to care much about anything. The fact was that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain and to waken her up a little. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She didn't feel cross when Martha chattered away. She felt as if she'd rather liked to hear her, and at last she thought she would ask her a question. She asked it after she had finished her supper, and had sat down on the hearthrug before the fire.
"Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden?"
She'd made Martha stay with her, and Martha had not objected at all. She was very young, was used to a crowded cottage, full of brothers and sisters, and she found it dull in the great servants' hall downstairs, where the footmen and upper housemaids made fun of her Yorkshire speech and looked upon her as a common little thing, and sat and whispered among themselves. Martha liked to talk, and the strange child who lived in India and had been waited upon by the natives was novelty enough to attract her. She sat down on the hearth herself without waiting to be asked.
"Are you thinking about that garden yet? I knew you would. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it." "Why did he hate it?"
And Martha tucked her feet under her and made herself quite comfortable.
"Listen to the wind whirling up around the house. You could barely stand up on the moor if you was out on it tonight."
And Mary didn't know what wuthering meant until she listened. Then she understood. It must be that hollow, shuddering sort of roar which rushed round and round the house, as if the giant no one could see were buffeting it and beating at all the walls and the windows to try to break in. But one knew he couldn't get in, and somehow it made one feel very safe and warm inside a room with a red coal fire.
"But why did he hate it so?"
she asked after she'd listened. She intended to know if Martha did. Then Martha finally gave up her store of knowledge.
Miss Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place not to be talked over. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His trouble's an unservice business, he says. But for the garden, he wouldn't be like it is. It was Miss Craven's garden that she'd just made when they first were married, and she loved it, and they used to tend the flowers themselves. And none of the gardeners was ever to go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there hours and hours reading and talking. Oh, and she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it, and she made roses grow over it. She used to sit there. One day she was sitting there, the branch broke, she fell on the ground, hurt so bad the next day she died. Doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too, that's why he hates it. No one's ever gone in since, and he won't let anyone ever talk about it. I definitely broke character voice on that, oops. It's fine. Mary didn't ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. At that moment a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She felt as if she had understood her Robin, and that he had understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life, and she found out what it was to be sorry for someone. But as she was listening to the wind, she began to listen to something else. She didn't know what it was, because at first she could scarcely distinguish it from the wind itself. It was a curious sound. It seemed almost as though a child were crying somewhere. Sometimes the wind sounded rather like a child crying, but presently Mistress Mary felt quite sure this sound was inside the house, not outside. It was far away, but it was inside. She looked round and looked at Martha. "Do you hear anyone crying?"
And Martha looked suddenly confused.
"No, it's the wind. Sometimes it sounds like someone's lost on the moor and wailing, but it's got all sorts of sounds." "But listen, it's in the house down one of those long corridors."
And at that very moment a door must have been opened somewhere downstairs, for a great rushing draught blew along the passage, and the door of the room they sat in was blown open with a crash. As they both jumped to their feet, the light was blown out, and the crying sound was swept down the far corridor, so that it was to be heard more plainly than ever.
"There, I told you so. It's someone crying, and it isn't a grown-up person."
Martha ran and shut the door and turned the key, but before she did it, they both heard the sound of a door in some far passage shutting with a bang. Then everything was quiet, for even the wind ceased wuthering for a few moments.
"It was the wind. And if it wasn't, it was little Betty Butterworth, the scullery maid. She's had a toothache all day."
But something troubled and awkward in her manner made Mistress Mary stare very hard at her. She didn't believe she was speaking the truth. Chapter 6. There was someone crying. There was. The next day the rain poured down in torrents again, and when Mary looked out of her window, the moor was almost hidden by grey mist and clouds. There would be no going out today. "What do you do in your cottage when it rains like this?" "Try to keep out from under everybody's feet, mostly. There does seem to be a lot of us then. Mother's a good-tempered woman, but she gets fair mothered. The biggest ones go out in a cowshed and plays there. Dickon doesn't mind the wet, and he just goes out same as if the sun was shining. Says he sees things on rainy days that doesn't show when it's fair weather. He once found a little foxglove half drowned in its hole, and he brought it home in the bosom of his shirt to keep it warm. The mother had been killed nearby, and the hole swum out, and all the rest of the litter is dead. He's got it at home now. Found a half-drowned young crow another time, brought it home and tamed it. It's named Soot 'cause it's so black, and it hops and flies with him everywhere." The time had come when Mary had forgotten to resent Martha's familiar talk. She'd even begun to find it interesting and to be sorry when she stopped or went away. The stories she'd been told by her Aya when she lived in India had been quite unlike those Martha had to tell about the moorland cottage, which held 14 people who lived in 4 little rooms and never quite enough to eat. The children seemed to rumble about and amuse themselves with a litter of rough, good-natured collie puppies. Mary was most attracted by the mother and Dickon. When Martha told stories of what Mother said or did, they always sounded comfortable. "If I had a raven or a fox cub, I could play with it, but I have nothing." And Martha looked perplexed. "Can you knit?" "No." "Can you sew?" "No." "Can you read?" "Yes." "Then why don't you read something or learn a bit of spelling? I was old enough to learn a good bit by now." "I haven't any books. Those I had were left in India." "Oh, that's a pity. Miss Medlock lets you go into the library. There's thousands of books in there." Mary didn't ask where the library was because she was suddenly inspired by a new idea. She made up her mind to go and find it herself. She wasn't troubled about Miss Medlock. Miss Medlock seemed always to be in her comfortable housekeeper's sitting room downstairs. In this queer place one hardly saw anyone at all. In fact, there was no one to see but the servants. When their master was away, they lived a luxurious life below stairs. There was a huge kitchen hung about with shining brass and pewter, and a large servants' hall where there were 4 or 5 abundant meals eaten every day, where a great deal of lively romping went on when Miss Medlock was out of the way. Mary's meals were served regularly, and Martha waited on her, but no one troubled themselves about her in the least. Miss Medlock came and looked at her every day or two, but no one inquired what she did or told her what to do. She supposed perhaps this was the English way of treating children. In India she'd always been attended by her Ayah, who had been following her about and waited on her hand and foot. She'd often been tired of her company. Now she was followed by nobody and was learning to dress herself because Martha looked as though she thought she was silly and stupid when she wanted to have things handed to her and put on. "Haven't you got good sense?" she'd said once when Mary had stood waiting to put her gloves on for her. "Our Susan Ann's twice as sharp as you. She's only 4 years old. Sometimes looks fair soft in her head." Mary had worn a contrary scowl for an hour after that, but it made her think in several entirely new things. She stood at the window for about 10 minutes this morning, after Martha had swept up the hearth for the last time and gone downstairs. She was thinking over the idea that had come to her when she'd heard of the library. She didn't care very much about the library itself, because she'd read very few books, but to hear of it brought her back to her mind the 100 rooms with the closed doors. She wondered if they were all really locked, and what she would find if she could get into any of them. Were there 100 really? Why couldn't she go and see how many doors she could count? It'd be something to do on this morning when she couldn't go out. She'd never been taught to ask permission to do things, and she knew nothing at all about authority, so she wouldn't have thought it necessary to ask Miss Medlock if she might walk about the house, even if she had seen her. She opened the door of the room and went into the corridor. Then she began her wanderings. It was a long corridor, and it branched into other corridors and led her up short flights of steps, which mounted to others again. There were doors and doors, and there were pictures on the walls. Sometimes they were pictures of dark, curious landscapes, but oftenest they were portraits of men and women in queer, grand costumes made of satin and velvet. She found herself in one long gallery whose walls were covered with these portraits. She'd never thought there could be so many in any house. She walked slowly down this place and stared at the faces, which also seemed to stare at her. She felt as if they were wondering what a little girl from India was doing in their house. Some were pictures of children, little girls in thick satin frocks which reached to their feet and stood out about them, and boys with puffed sleeves and lace collars and long hair, or with big ruffs around their necks. She always stopped to look at the children and wonder what their names were, where they'd gone, why they wore such odd clothes. There was a stiff, plain little girl rather like herself. She wore a green brocade dress and held a green parrot on her finger. Her eyes had a sharp, curious look.
"Where do you live now?" said Mary aloud to her. "I wish you were here."
Surely no other little girl had ever spent such a queer morning. It seemed as if there was no one at all in the huge rambling house but her own small self, wandering about upstairs and down, through narrow passages and wide ones, where it seemed to her that no one but herself had ever walked. Since so many rooms had been built, people must have lived in them, but it all seemed so empty that she couldn't quite believe it was true. It wasn't until she climbed to the second floor that she thought of turning the handle of a door. All the doors were shut, as Miss Medlock had said they were, but at last she put her hand on the handle of one of them and turned it. She was almost frightened for a moment when she felt that it turned without difficulty, and that when she opened the door it slowly and heavily moved at her push. It was a massive door, and it opened into a big bedroom. There were embroidered hangings on the wall, and inlaid furniture such as she had seen in India stood about the room. A broad window with leaded panes looked out upon the moor, and over the mantel was another portrait of the stiff, plain little girl, who seemed to stare at her more curiously than ever.
"Perhaps she slept here once. She stares at me so that she makes me feel queer."
And after that she opened more doors and more. She saw so many rooms that she became quite tired, and began to think that there must be 100, though she had not counted them. In all of them there were old pictures or old tapestries with strange scenes worked on them. There were curious pieces of furniture and curious ornaments in nearly all of them. In one room, which looked like a lady's sitting room, the hangings were all embroidered velvet, and in a cabinet there were about 100 little elephants made of ivory. They were of different sizes, and some had their mahouts. Mahouts are palanquins on their back. Some were much bigger than the others, and some were so tiny that they seemed only babies. Mary had seen carved ivory in India, and she knew all about elephants. She opened the door of the cabinet and stood on a footstool and played with these for quite a long time. When she got tired, she set the elephants back in order and shut the door of the cabinet. In all her wanderings through the long corridors and the empty rooms, she'd seen nothing alive, but in this room she saw something. Just after she'd closed the cabinet door, she heard a tiny rustling sound. It made her jump and look around at the sofa by the fireplace, from which it seemed to come. In the corner of the sofa there was a cushion, and in the velvet from which it covered there was a hole, and out of the hole peeped a tiny head with a pair of frightened eyes in it. Mary crouched softly across the room to look. The bright eyes had belonged to a little gray mouse, and the mouse had eaten a hole in the cushion and made up a comfortable nest there. 6 baby mice were cuddled up asleep near her. If there was no one else alive in the 100 rooms, there were 7 mice who didn't look lonely at all.
"If they wouldn't be so frightened, I'd take them back with me," said Mary.
And she had wandered about long enough to feel too tired to wander any farther, so she turned back. 2 or 3 times she lost her way by turning down the wrong corridor, and was obliged to ramble up and down until she found the right one. But at last she reached her own floor again, though she was some distance from her own room, and didn't know exactly where she was.
"I believe I've taken a wrong turning again,"
she said, standing still at what seemed the end of a short passage with a tapestry on the wall.
"I don't know which way to go. How still everything is."
It was while she was standing here, and just after she had said this, that the stillness was broken by a sound. It was another cry, but not quite like the one she'd heard last night. It was only a short one, a fretful, childish whine, muffled by passing through walls. "It's nearer than it was," said Mary, her heart beating rather faster, "and it's crying." She put her hand accidentally upon the tapestry near her, and then sprang back, feeling quite startled. The tapestry was covering a door, which fell open and showed her that there was another part of the corridor behind it, and Miss Medlock was coming up it with her bunch of keys in her hand and a very cross look on her face. "What are you doing here?" she said, and she took Mary by the arm and pulled her away. "What did I tell you?" "I turned round the wrong corner. I didn't know which way to go, and I heard someone crying." She quite hated Miss Medlock at the moment, but she hated her more the next. "You didn't hear anything of the sort. You come along back to your own nursery. I'll box your ears." And she took her by the arm and half pushed, half pulled her up one passage and down another, till she pushed her into the door of her own room. "Now you stay where you're told to stay, or you'll find yourself locked up. The master had better get you a governess, same as he said he would. You're one that needs someone sharp to look after you. I've got enough to do." And she went out of the room and slammed the door after her, and Mary went and sat on the hearth-rug, pale with rage. She didn't cry, but she ground her teeth. "There was someone crying. There was," she said to herself. And she'd heard it twice now, and sometime she would find out. She had found out a great deal this morning. She felt as if she'd been on a long journey, and at any rate she had had something to amuse her all the time. She'd played with the ivory elephants and seen the grey mouse and its babies in their nest in the velvet cushion. Chapter 7. The Key to the Garden. 2 days after this, when Mary opened her eyes, she sat upright in bed immediately and called to Martha. "Look at the moor! Look at the moor!" The rainstorm had ended, and the grey mist and clouds had been swept away in the night by the wind. The wind itself had ceased, and a brilliant deep blue sky arched high over the moorland. Never, never had Mary dreamed of a sky so blue. In India skies were hot and blazing. This was a cool, deep blue, which seemed to sparkle like the waters of some lovely bottomless lake, and here and there, high, high in the arched blueness, floated small clouds of snow-white fleece. The far-reaching world of the moor itself looked softly blue instead of gloomy purple-black or awful dreary grey. "Aye," said Martha with a cheerful grin. "Storm's over for a bit. Does look like this time of year. Goes off in a night like it's pretended it never been here and never meant to come again. That's 'cause springtime's on its way. It's a long way off yet, but it's coming." "I thought perhaps it always rained or looked dark in England." "Oh, no," said Martha, sitting up on her heels among her black lead brushes. "No, sir." "What's that mean?" asked Mary seriously. In India the natives spoke different dialects which only a few people understood, so she wasn't surprised when Martha used words she didn't know. And Martha laughed as she'd done the first morning. "There now, I've talked broad Yorkshire again, like Miss Medlock says I mustn't. No, sir, it means nothing of the sort. Slowly and carefully, but it takes so long to say it. Yorkshire's the sunniest place on earth when it's sunny. I told you you'd like the moor after a bit. Just you wait until you see the gold-colored gorse blossoms bloom, heather flying on all purple bells, hundreds of butterflies fluttering, bees humming, skylarks soaring up and singing. You want to get out on it in the sunrise and live out on it all day, like Dickon does." "Could I ever get there?" asked Mary wistfully, looking through a window at the far-off blue. It was so new and big and wonderful, and such a heavenly color. "I don't know. There's never used to that lake since I was born, it seems to me. Couldn't walk 5 miles from the cottage." "I should like to see your cottage." Martha stared at her a moment, curiously, before she took up her polishing brush and began to rub the grate again. She was thinking of the small, plain face that did not quite look as sour at this moment as it had done when the first morning she'd seen it. It looked just a trifle like little Susan Ann's when she wanted something very much.
I'll ask my mother about it. She's one of them that nearly always sees a way to do things. Well, it's my day out today, and I'm going home. I'm glad about it. Miss Medlock thinks a lot of Mother. Perhaps you'd talk to her. I like your mother. I should think you did. I've never seen her. No, you haven't. And she sat up on her heels again and rubbed the end of her nose with the back of her hand, as if puzzled for a moment, but she ended quite positively. Well, she's sensible and hard-working, good-natured and clean, so nobody helped collecting her when you see her or not. When I'm going home or on my day out, I just jump for joy and across the moor. I like Dickon, and I've never seen him. Well, I told you the very birds like him, the rabbits, the wild sheep and ponies and foxes. I wonder what Dickon would think of you, she said, staring at her reflectively. He wouldn't like me, said Mary in a stiff, cold little way. No one does. And Martha looked reflective again. How do you like yourself? She inquired, quite as if she were curious to know. And Mary hesitated a moment and thought it over. Not at all, really. But I never thought of that before. Martha grinned a little as if at some homely recollection. Mother said that to me once. She was at a wash tub and I was in a bad temper, talking ill of folks. She turns around on me and says, "How does your vixen here? They're saying it is like this and it isn't like that. How do you like yourself?" Made me laugh and brought me to my senses in a minute. She went away in high spirits as soon as she'd given Mary her breakfast. She was going to walk 5 miles across the moor to the cottage, and she was going to help her mother with the washing and do the week's baking and enjoy herself thoroughly. Mary felt lonelier than ever when she knew she was no longer in the house. She went out into the garden as quickly as possible, and the first thing she did was run round and round the flower fountain 10 times. She counted the times carefully, and when she had finished she felt in better spirits. The sunshine made the whole place look different. The high, deep blue sky arched over Misselthwaite, as well as over the moor, and she kept lifting her face and looking up into it, trying to imagine what it would be like to lie down on one of the little snow-white clouds and float about. She went into the first kitchen garden, and found Ben Weatherstaff working there with 2 other gardeners. The change in the weather seemed to have done him good, and he spoke to her of his own accord.
Springtime's coming. Can't you smell it?
Mary sniffed and thought she could. I smell something nice and damp.
That's the good fresh earth,
he answered, digging away.
It's in a good humor making ready to grow things. It's glad when planting time comes. Dull in winter was nothing to do. The flower garden out there seems to be stirring down below in the dark. Sun's warming them. You see bits of green spikes sticking out like earth after a bit.
What will they be?
There are crocuses and snowdrops and daffodils. Have you ever seen them?
No, everything's hot and wet and green after the rains in India. I think where things grow up in a night.
These won't grow up in a night. You gotta wait for 'em. Poke up a bit higher here, push out a spike more there, and uncurl a leaf this day and another that. You watch 'em.
I'm going to. And very soon she heard the soft rustling flight of wings again, and she knew at once that the robin had come again. He was very pert and lively, and hopped about so close to her feet, and put his head on one side and looked at her so slyly that she asked Ben Weatherstaff a question. Do you think he remembers me?
Remembers you? He knows every cabbage stem in the gardens, let alone the people. You never seen a little wench here before. He's bent on finding all about you. There's no need to hide anything from him.
Are things stirring down below in the dark in the garden where he lives?
What garden?
Grunted Weatherstaff, becoming surly again. The one where the old rose trees are. She couldn't help asking because she wanted so badly to know. Are all the flowers dead, or do some of them come again in the summer? Are there ever any roses?
I ask him,
said Weatherstaff, hunching his shoulders toward the robin.
He's the only one that knows. No one else has ever been inside it for 10 years.
10 years was a long time, Mary thought. She'd been born 10 years ago. She walked away, slowly thinking. She'd begun to like the garden, just as she'd begun to like the robin and Dickon and Martha's mother. She was beginning to like Martha, too.
that seemed a good many people to like when you weren't used to this liking. She thought of the robin as one of the people. She went to her walk outside the long, ivy-covered wall, over which she could see the tree-tops. And the second time she walked up and down, the most interesting, exciting thing happened to her, and it was all through Ben Weatherstaff's robin. She heard a chirp and a twitter, and when she looked at the bare flower bed at her left side, there he was hopping about and pretending to peck things out of the earth to persuade her that he hadn't followed her. But she knew he'd followed her, and the surprise filled her with so much delight that she almost trembled a little. "You do remember me. You do. You're prettier than everything else in the world." She chirped and talked and coaxed as he hopped, and flitted the tail, and he twittered. It was as if he were talking. His red waistcoat was like satin, and he puffed his tiny chest out, and was so fine and so grand and so pretty that it was really as if he were showing her how important and like a human person a robin could be. Mistress Mary forgot that she'd ever been contrary in her life, when he allowed her to draw closer and closer to him, and bend down and talk and try to make something like robin sounds. Oh, to think he should actually let her come as near to him as that! He knew nothing in the world would make her put out her hand toward him or startle him in the least tiniest way. He knew it because he was a real person, only nicer than any other person in the world. She was so happy that she scarcely dared to breathe. And the flower bed wasn't quite bare. It was bare of flowers because the perennial plants had been cut down for their winter rest, but there were tall shrubs and low ones which grew together at the back of the bed, and as the robin hopped about under them, she saw him hop over a small pile of freshly turned up earth. He stopped on it to look for a worm. The earth had been turned up because Dog had been trying to dig up a mole, and he'd scratched quite a deep hole. Mary looked at it, not quite knowing why the hole was there, and as she looked, she saw something almost buried in the newly turned soil. It was something like a ring of rusty iron or brass. When the robin flew up into a tree nearby, she put out her hand and picked the thing up. It was more than a ring, however. It was an old key, which looked as if it had been buried a long time. Mistress Mary stood up and looked at it with an almost frightened face as it hung from her finger. "Perhaps it had been buried for 10 years. Perhaps it's the key to the garden." Okay, that's a suitably dramatic note to end the evening on. So, this has been Paper Cuts. On the brand new time, same bat channel. If you want to catch up, the videos go up Thursday noon, and then we've moved the show recordings to Thursday evenings. So feel free to drop in on that. Anyway, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.